All right. Well, thank you very much, all of you, for coming. It's the first sunny day that I've seen, really, since I've been in Bochum now for almost a month. So that's nice of you to give it up to come to this and sit in this dark lecture hall and listen to me. I also wanted to, in addition to thanking Thomas for that lovely introduction, also Tina for welcoming me here in Bochum. To the Institute of Archaeology, the Bergbau Museum, the Ruhr University, and of course the Leibniz Fund for its support of the Resources in Transformation project. I also want to apologize for speaking in English tonight. Mein Deutsch ist immer noch nicht so gut, aber immer besser. I was very enthusiastic to have a chance to join the Reform project for a few months. I believe we really need to rethink how we understand that particular category of material things that we call resources. Much of what I have to say tonight comes from work on my new book project, which I've given the hopefully intriguing title, The Age of Immaterialism. A warning that it's very much a work in progress, but one with a goal of reaching a wider popular audience and public policy authorities. Because I argue that our growing disconnect from the resources we depend upon explains a great deal about the causes of many of our contemporary challenges, and not just environmental ones. So let me begin with a confession. I am a monster. Now, in the spirit of generosity, you may suspect that I'm being too hard on myself. But as you'll see, the evidence against me is actually pretty damning. I am not only a monster, but I have and still do act in monstrous ways. Still, I might shift the guilt from myself at least a little bit by being so rude as to suggest that to one degree or another, I suspect that many of you are also monsters. Though not in precisely the same grievous way that I, an American born in 1960, am a monster. So let me be more precise. I am an American monster of the post-World War II era. Now, having admitted my own monstrous nature, an obvious question presents itself. How did this happen? How have I, a well-meaning person who tries to be decent and public-spirited, nonetheless become a monster? There are likely many causes, but today I want to focus on two. The first is a matter of physiology and biology, a question of my essential physical nature. The second is more a matter of how I think, my cognitive nature, if you will. The two are no doubt closely related, but demand different historical approaches. So to get at the first one, my physiological monstrousness, let me tell you about the National Science Foundation grant proposal that I'm now working on. Homo Materialis, a physiological and cognitive history of the species during the Great Acceleration, 1945 to 2001. The basic concept is simply enough put. Historians like myself generally take it for granted that human beings have not changed in any important physiological or cognitive way over the course of history. Culturally, socially, politically, of course, but not biologically. In this, we still share the view of that British historian, R.G. Collingwood, who, writing in the 1940s, assumed that he and every other modern human were basically the same animal as all the other humans who had ever lived over the past 5,000 years or so. In fact, Collingwood's epistemology of history depended on this continuity, as he argued that the task of the true historian was to use written records to put themselves into the heads of earlier humans so as to understand their thoughts, motivations, and hence their actions. By contrast, if that were not true that earlier humans were in essence the same as himself, then how could Collingwood be confident of his ability to get inside the heads of, say, a Roman Caesar or a French Jacobin? If his historical subject was in truth physiologically different, then the central task of the historian must also change. Rather than time-traveling thought experiments, the historian must ask, what had made historical peoples physiologically different, and with what consequences? Moreover, it would seem apparent that perhaps the most important causes of those differences would be that his subjects lived in environments that were often radically different than those of the present. Now, I'm simplifying, but you can see where this is going. The NSF grant proposes that Collingwood's assumption was wrong, and hence the proper task of the historian is not to get inside the heads of past humans, but rather to get into the environments that shaped those heads and the bodies that carried those heads around. It is in these largely uncharted historical waters that, as the borders of early European maps sometimes suggest, there be monsters. Now, I'd first been compelled to confront my own monstrousness by my own environment and the contemporary thinking that it has inspired among other historians. Most important were the environmental historians who had developed the concept of the porous body, a transformative idea that was itself the product of new post-war ecological insights. As Linda Nash and others have argued, the modern belief that our bodies are clearly bounded and separated from the environment is an illusion. Instead, ecological science had shown that toxins like DDT or radioactive particles penetrated our porous bodies through a variety of complex pathways, thus connecting every human to the material environment at a physiological level. Ecologies were, as Nash put it, inescapable. Now, keeping this porous body in mind, consider some extraordinary statistics. Since 1945, the global production of synthetic chemicals has increased more than 30-fold. There are roughly 80,000 entirely novel chemicals currently in wide use in the United States today, of which only about 200 have been tested for their effect on humans. Many of these chemicals now saturate our environments and bodies through our daily interactions with plastics, pesticide residues, chemically treated clothing and furniture, and many other pathways. What the German magazine Focus described as unser täglich Gift. Examining these transformations, the historian Julia Adney Thomas has raised the very same provocative question that I wish to pursue. Is it not possible that the Anthropocene sudden chemical acceleration now separates us physiologically from pre-war human beings? Possible indeed. Take, for example, the historical consequences of the novel synthetic hormone diethylstilbestrol, or DES, first synthesized from coal tar by a British scientist in 1938. As Nancy Langston has shown, despite evidence that it was unsafe, DES was approved for use in the United States as a treatment for menopause, which the overwhelmingly male medical profession often viewed as a medical condition in need of curing. The drug was subsequently prescribed to prevent miscarriages. Americans even used DES as an additive to cattle feed to accelerate their rate of growth. Over time, however, the evidence began to accumulate that DES was what we now term an endocrine disruptor. The chemical interferes with the body's normal hormonal regulatory system in ways that can cause reproductive cancers, not just in the women who take it or took it, but also in their daughters. So it was that a set of highly patriarchal and sexist American cultural beliefs became literally embedded into the physiological nature of many post-war Americans, with immense, though difficult to quantify, historical consequences. Moreover, this new chemical environment was just one of countless abrupt changes in our use of resources, constituting what historian John McNeill and others have aptly termed the Great Acceleration. It's no exaggeration to observe that since 1945, many humans have lived in a radically different environment than had predominated in the previous millennia of human existence, including a rapid and continuing growth in the use of minerals, some of them quite novel, like lithium and cobalt. We also know now that there are many other mechanisms through which this seemingly external material environment is incorporated into our internal physiological and probably cognitive nature, such as epigenetics, pathways that can turn off genes, turn them on, or environmental effects on our individual microbiomes. And so you begin to see why I am indeed a sort of physiological monster. In fact, my mother actually took DES when she was carrying my eldest brother, though not when she was carrying me. Still, there was no escaping DES for Americans living in the 1960s. I probably consumed at least small amounts of the chemical during our weekly Sunday dinners of American roast beef. So far as I know, my brothers and I have not suffered any ill effects from this, though it's immensely difficult to know such things with any certainty. And if my older brother had been a sister, our story might have been horrifically different. So to return to my NSF grant, the proposal is to take seriously the idea that moderns like myself have become so monstrous that Collingwood was clearly wrong. We are not, in essence, the same creatures as the historical subjects we attempt to study. As a consequence, I argue both that we must read historical documents with this reality in mind, but perhaps more importantly, we must also pay far more attention to the role of material environments in shaping past societies. Societies which might have incidentally had their own monstrous qualities, as with the noxious coal pollution of London, or the arsenic, lead, and other heavy metals generated in Western Montana by copper mining smelters that very clearly penetrated the bodies of ranchers and farmers and influenced their actions. So in this project, I would, of course, have to partner with the scientists and social scientists who have begun to interrogate how chemicals and other environmental changes affect sociocultural phenomena in the present. As one researcher recently observed in a top American science journal, if pollution can affect reasoned judgment and decision-making, then perhaps every aspect of daily living may be altered by our contaminated environment. Still, I'd be the first to admit that the project faces some very daunting obstacles. It is very difficult to demonstrate how complex chemicals, epigenetic factors, or changes in our microbiome actually affect human behavior and decisions, and thus the course of history. Perhaps that's why few historians have even tried. This kind of interdisciplinary work is also challenging. In my own scientific headhunting, I found that many scientific experts are intrigued by these questions, but most also quickly add that they're very busy with grants of their own, and that such an ambitious project would take considerable time and money to carry out effectively. We'll see if the NSF provides the money. Until then, this physiological approach remains intriguing, if not yet fully demonstrated. Perhaps some of you might help me to imagine ways to move forward. Which brings me to the second, though complementary way in which I argue that I am a monster. Here I shift from an expensive reliance on science and scientists to instead draw upon the concept of what is variously termed the extended or embodied mind. The advocates of the porous body that I was telling you about, by and large, stopped short of arguing for a porous brain or a porous mind. However, new theories of the extended mind suggest something very much like that. Andy Clark, David Chalmers, and other recent students of cognition argue that our minds are not entirely inside our skulls, but reside also in the material things around us. In this sense, we think not only through abstract ideas, words, or beliefs that are inside our heads, but also through the material things that surround us, both natural and anthropogenic. Importantly, for my purposes, the extended minds of past humans have also clearly shaped and reshaped our current environment, leaving their traces in the buildings, the machines, and other artifacts that endure into the present. Recall, for example, how the sexist cultural beliefs of mid-century American doctors became embedded through DES, literally into the bodies of mothers and their daughters for decades. The extended mind, thus, is not only a spatial extension of our minds into the current material environment, but also a temporal extension of the minds of the past that now shape how we think in the present. Now, as I've been researching the book I told you about over the past few years, I also began to realize that there was a strange historical contradiction at work in these extended minds of the post-World War II period. That is this, that what is arguably the most materially entangled era in human history had been accompanied by a simultaneous denial of that very entanglement, giving rise to what I've termed this age of immaterialism. Indeed, I argue that the two are tightly connected, as the reality of our growing material embeddedness and its consequences is made more painless and more tolerable by the illusions of immateriality. In the book, I examine the influences of this on many different arenas, everything from our lack of daily contact with non-human animals, to increasingly abstracted academic theories, to the rise of political extremism, and most obviously, the advent of our brave new world of virtual digital living, and so-called artificial intelligence. At base, though, I argue all of these broader immaterialisms are rooted in the changing ways we have come to extract and use resources in the post-war era. Now, here are some concrete examples will be helpful, and I have three. So to understand my thinking and how my thinking is developed on this sort of double move of greater materiality paired with the illusion of greater immateriality, it seems especially appropriate here in Bochum to begin with coal. Many of us are probably familiar with two very influential books published about 15 years ago. Thomas Andrews' Killing for Coal and Timothy Mitchell's Carbon Democracy. Both Andrews and Mitchell, albeit in somewhat different ways, argue that the material nature of coal played a critical role in the rise of miners' unions, and thus the development of at least some level of economic democracy surrounding that resource in the mid-20th century. Now, by this, they intend not so much that the expansion of democracy likely did depend on the expansion of hydrocarbon energy supplies, or as Dipesh Chakrabarty nicely put it, the mansion of modern freedoms stands on an ever-expanding base of fossil fuel use. Rather, both authors emphasize the physical nature of coal itself and coal mines that favored historically specific methods of extracting, processing, transporting coal in order to benefit from its transformative energetic possibilities. Now, for his part, Tom Andrews recasts a well-known chapter in American labor history, the infamous Ludlow Massacre of 1914. He reframes the environment of the underground coal mines of southern Colorado, controlled by the powerful Rockefeller family, as a creative source, a dynamic source for the development of worker solidarity. The mines, with all their attendant dangers and possibilities to escape close managerial supervision, played a key role in fostering a sense of worker solidarity across diverse ethnic and national languages and cultures. To think about this in the terms of the extended mine, the material geological nature of coal helped the miners to think and act differently. Though, of course, there were other factors at work. Now, Mitchell's Carbon Democracy offers a different yet resonant argument. Examining British and European coal miners in the post-war period, Mitchell again shifts our attention from humans to argue that the nature of the coal itself, in particular, its bulky, uneven, hard to handle property, made it very labor intensive to move to the cities and factories where it was needed, creating all sorts of potential choke points that unions could use. The material properties of the coal thus granted miners and their allies among rail and dock workers the opportunity to exert considerable economic and political power by threatening to cut off energy. Now, all this sounds very promising, at least if you're an old-fashioned liberal unionist like myself. However, it was not to last. In both cases, the potential of these resource-embedded unions to foster some semblance of economic democracy were effectively undermined by capitalists and state interests who saw them as a threat to their own power and wealth. In the case of the Ludlow miners, nascent efforts to unionize, the Colorado National Guard joined forces with Rockefeller's private guns to simply put down the strike through sheer violence, killing 21 men, women, and children during the infamous Ludlow Massacre. But there are other more subtle means of undermining unions and democracy, the power of coal. In Andrews' books, for example, he follows the coal from those killing fields into the homes of Denver citizens who burned it to stay warm. Tellingly, the way Denverites used coal had already begun to diverge along class and racial lines. In contrast to the poor and ethnic minorities like the Chinese and African Americans in Denver, who simply used their own hands to place pieces of the cheapest and dirtiest coal onto their living room hearths, the wealthy of Denver, the elites of Denver increasingly enjoyed cellar-based coal furnaces, where hired servants or mechanical feeders removed the need for elite residents to get their hands dirty. So whatever inescapable materialities there might have been in the dangerous workscape of the mine, coal and all of its messy and troubling and violent associations could still be kept at a distance if one only had enough money. This new manner of immaterialism enjoyed by the rich in Denver or elsewhere would only become more pronounced and widespread in the simultaneous shift to another key resource of modernity, copper. Consider that when one of the poor citizens of Denver threw a piece of coal onto the grate, they would have an embodied experience of a material resource that literally came from a different place. In some small, but I'd argue not insignificant way, they would know something about coal's properties, including its dangers, and perhaps even a fleeting thought of the fellow human beings who risked their lives to extract it from the earth. But with electricity, the messy burning of coal could be removed from the home altogether, relocated to coal-fired electric power plants. The energy of the coal could instead be transmitted to homes over vast networks of thick copper wires. That embodied visceral sense of the actual source of light and power now simply vanished. Indeed, in many modern post-war homes and neighborhoods, increasingly the wires of copper that made this possible were buried or hidden behind walls. So one didn't even have to confront the reality of the copper that surrounds them. Now, finally, to return to Mitchell, he argues there was also a more dangerous and enduring way to undermine the mines and the miners' unions: the increasing post-war shift from coal to oil. Beyond its greater energy density and its importance as a fuel for the expanding use of the automobile, which I'll return to in a bit, oil was also attractive to many national and capitalist agents because it could circumvent the labor-intensive chokeholds of coal. Once constructed, oil wells oil wells demand relatively little human labor. Further, in contrast to the bulky, hard-to-handle coal, oil's fluid nature meant it could be smoothly and quietly and mysteriously transported, being via pipelines and oil tankers. In other words, the basic materiality of oil made it possible to circumvent both coal miners and longshoremen and rail workers and the unions and their empowerment. Appropriately enough, I was just realizing last night, some of you may be aware of this, that today is actually Pearl Harbor Day in the United States. The anniversary of the 1941 Japanese attack on that American colonial outpost of Hawaii. An attack that most Americans to this day don't realize was the result of a much bigger imperial battle for the control of the resources of the Pacific. Indeed, this ignorance that the war in the Pacific was at least in part a war over resources is yet another symptom of the age of the immaterialism that I'm talking about. As Megan Black reveals in her recent and very disturbing history of the United States Department of Interior, the global interior, in the post-war era, the US depended ever more heavily on its access to global mineral supplies, most especially oil. Now, whether the US achieved this through cooperation with anti-democratic authoritarians or outright violence and coups, Black reveals how the Department of Interior fostered a highly abstracted and immaterialist view of the mineral resources it was plundering. It promoted, for example, the idea of global minerals that belongs not to any one nation, but to the world. That this arrangement was largely one-sided and to the benefit of the United States perhaps goes without saying. Yet the point Black makes that is of special value to me, my argument, is that in making the exterior global resources into interior domestic resources, the Department of Interior played a key role in obstructing what was an essentially imperial process. Thus, even as post-war Americans and others were using vastly more hydrocarbon-based energy than ever before, the shift from coal to oil fused seamlessly with the obfuscations created by the Department of the Interior to make it easier than ever to ignore and deny this reality. Oil thus becomes the perfect resource to fuel the new age of immaterialism. Now, once you start to think about this, the ways in which Americans have increasingly denied both their national and personal dependence on resources can be found everywhere, even with the most ubiquitous and seemingly hard to ignore of resources. By volume and weight, the single biggest resource currently in use on the planet today is cement-based concrete. In his 2022 book, How the World Really Works, that evangelist of all things quantifiable, Václav Smil, includes concrete as one of the 4 pillars of modern civilization, along with steel, plastic, and ammonia used for fertilizers. Yet of these 4 resources, concrete, which is a mixture of limestone-based cement with much larger amounts of sand and gravel, is by far and away the thickest of those pillars. Even in an age of awe-inspiring numbers, the statistics on the modern use of cement and concrete are truly breathtaking. The world produces about 4.25 billion metric tons of cement every year, which in turn is used to make an astounding 30 billion tons of concrete. The United Nations has estimated that if we, or perhaps Donald Trump, were to build a wall around the equator using the concrete produced in the year 2012 alone, it would be 27 meters high and 27 meters deep. The scale of extraction is so immense that it has even made sand, that classic low-value Cinderella mineral that might seem inexhaustible, an increasingly scarce resource, at least in some urbanizing areas, even giving rise to organized crime rings dedicated to stealing, of all things, sand. Further dredging of sand from beaches and riverbeds in India, Vietnam, and other areas around the world is causing serious environmental damage as it generates huge clouds of silt, which damage fluvial ecosystems. Now, the cement itself, the sticky stuff that is the key ingredient of concrete, also has an outsized environmental impact. Cement is produced by mining limestone deposits and heating those to about 1,000 degrees centigrade in rotary kilns, an energy-intensive process that in the United States is still almost entirely fueled by hydrocarbons. Estimates suggest that cement production alone is responsible for somewhere around 7 to 8% of global carbon dioxide emissions. If the global cement industry were a country, it would be the fourth biggest greenhouse gas emitter in the world, just behind China, the United States, and India. In sum, there is perhaps nothing quite so materially concrete as concrete. If there were any resource whose consequences one might assume would be hard to ignore, concrete would be it. Ironically, though, the very ubiquity and solidity of concrete has also aided and abetted the age of immaterialism through its unparalleled ability to cheaply and easily separate humans from their environments. One of my doctoral students, Kirk Elsas, is writing a history of our most personal and everyday connections with cement-based concrete. He recognizes, of course, that concrete can be used for many different purposes, including building bridges to nature, literally and metaphorically. Yet in analyzing the history of concrete sidewalks, prisons, and other artifacts, Elsas concludes that modern cement has often been a uniquely powerful material of building apart, of dividing and sealing spaces. And now, as an example, Elsas studies the role of cement in creating one of the most archetypal spaces of post-war American suburbia, the famous cement-lined basement that many of us of a certain age grew up within. Now, prior to the development of cheap and readily available cemented concretes, most Americans would never imagine that they would willingly spend any significant time living underground. Many American houses were built of wood, and their cellars often had dirt walls, forcing even urban residents into at least occasional contact with the messier sides of the human environment. But by mid-century, these more porous spaces were increasingly viewed as damp, disorderly, too messy, non-human, and difficult to bound and control. So by contrast, Elsas argues that the new cement-walled basements of post-war American suburbia promise to bound that very chaos and to bring order to disorder. Because modern hydraulic cement is both very strong and extremely waterproof, it could keep out water, odors, spiders, creating now comfortable rooms. These new underground rooms, in turn, help to generate novel ways of living associated with post-war American domesticity, affluence, and leisure. Among the most original and effective ways of living sparked by cement walls were the brightly lit and colorful rec rooms, or recreational rooms. Interior spaces that were largely removed from functionality and work, and designed instead to create a sense of escape, entertainment, and the embrace of the trivial. Now, to be sure, these spaces might have been built in many other ways, yet Elsas argues the availability of cheap and effective concrete in the post-war era made their construction much easier and their effects more enduring. Even the concrete walls themselves, as you can see here, were often hidden behind wood paneling or faux brick facades, further denying its existence. And so, just as I surely consumed at least some DES in the 1960s and the 1970s, I can also personally testify to the formative powers of the suburban basement in shaping my own monstrous nature. My four brothers and I, post-war indeed, spent vast swaths of our childhoods in a basement much like this one here, cloistered away behind impregnable cement walls watching reruns of Star Trek and Bewitched, playing fantastic games, plotting schemes in her understair concrete-walled laboratory. Thanks in part to the power of cement to bound and separate, our basements became a place of self-invention, largely free of intrusions from the real world. I don't know that this freedom for fantasy and self-creation was necessarily a bad thing, but it was certainly a very modern and very immaterial thing. Unlike oil or electricity or copper, the concrete-lined basement distanced Americans not so much from the resource itself, but rather from a broader material world, both human and non-human. The basement thus helped to both generate and sustain the post-war American, quote, way of life. One increasingly removed from the gritty materiality of dirt, nature, and even the industrial workplace, as manual labor gave way to abstracted knowledge work and identities constructed around consumerism more than labor. Indeed, this cement basement would even contribute to the post-war American attempt to deny the emerging evidence of their own ecological embeddedness, a reality that they were increasingly confronted with in books like Rachel Carson's Silent Spring. You'll recall that Carson's influential 1962 book was in significant part the result of new ecological studies that were revealing how radioactive fallout from nuclear testing in the American Southwest could penetrate American bodies and homes through all sorts of nefarious pathways. Yet even here, Elsas notes that cement promised a means of escape, at least for those Americans fortunate enough to have basements that they could convert to bomb shelters and fallout shelters. Concrete basements, it would seem, could even wall off the nuclear family from nuclear war. In my final example. So let me turn now to some of my own recent work on what has for many years been one of the most important American, European, and increasingly global ways we interact with resources, the automobile. That the automobile is deeply implicated in modern resource extraction and use is apparent. The automotive industry is one of the largest consumers of raw materials in the world, using immense amounts of iron, aluminum, steel, glass, rubber, copper, and of course, petroleum. To be sure, some of the most valuable of these materials are recycled and reused. Yet, even with diligent recycling, the average mid-sized American SUV, sport utility vehicle, uses about 1,400 kilograms of steel alone, the sheer weight of which makes these giant truck cars inherently less efficient than smaller and lighter vehicles, regardless of whether they use energy from gasoline or from battery-stored electricity. In the US, the still predominantly internal combustion-powered cars and trucks are currently responsible for about 20% of the nation's massive greenhouse gas emissions. These and many other connections to resources are mostly well understood, and I'm not going to belabor them. Rather, my intent with this final example is to expose the automobile as an unusually powerful material mechanism for generating an extended mind that values individual freedom and power above all else, while simultaneously fostering an illusory distancing from the very resources that make that power possible. Here again, it's useful to keep in mind the materialities that had come before. This is especially true with the automobile because one of the transportation technologies that it largely replaced was another sentient animal, the horse. Horses have been deeply interwoven into whatever cultures that have partnered with them, much as automobiles have been today. And both technologies have offered somewhat similar possibilities of individual freedom, power, and speed. However, in contrast to the car, the horse has a mind and a will of its own, as we know all too well in my home state of Montana, where this is actually a thing. They have a bucking horse fair every year. Further, as the neuroscientist and horse trainer Janet Jones has recently argued, at its highest level, the human interaction with the horse can give rise to what she terms centaurs, a manner of monster or chimera in its own right. Indeed, Jones argues that repeated day-to-day human interaction with horses gives rise to a distinct and powerful type of extended mind, shared between two very different animals. Oops. Sorry, I thought I had a quote of that, but she says, quote, "Each of their minds has extended into the others, sending and receiving signals as if one united brain were controlling both bodies." Now, by contrast, the extended mind that emerged from our interaction with the automobile would be very, very different, if perhaps no less deeply formative. Indeed, in its early years, the automobile's particular fusing of resources like cheap gasoline, copper-wired electrical systems, steel bodies, could actually generate a deep human engagement with those very things. The early, simple, and often unreliable automobiles demanded a great deal of maintenance and repair from the driver if the machine was to do what they wanted it to do. Likewise, the mostly open-air automobiles forced the driver into an intimate engagement with the environment. As with riding a horse, automobile drivers were constantly exposed to the air and sun, wind and rain, the smells and sounds and dust of the passing countryside. Indeed, many actually sought this very exposure, as they saw their machines as a means to escape the alienating, unnatural world of cities and to return to the revitalizing nature of the countryside. Yet again, if the earlier decades of automobility could foster an intense individual engagement with both the machine and the environment, neither was to survive the aborting age of post-war immaterialism. As automobiles became more technologically complex, fewer and fewer drivers could take on the maintenance and repair of their machines, steadily bringing an end to one of the most important ways in which everyday people had actually personally interacted with resources like oil, gasoline, copper, steel. Likewise, as automobiles increasingly became utilitarian tools of everyday transportation, the open cockpit was walled off. Manufacturers developed cars designed to insulate, to separate the driver from both the machine itself and the world around them. These sheet metal walls and roofs, along with glass windows, could be so tightly sealed that the interior of the modern car was nearly as controlled as Alsace's cement-lined basements. The smooth, quiet power of a post-war American land yacht, like this, a 1950 Cadillac, so quiet, promised to remove the driver from almost any embodied engagement with the outside world, leaving only that most abstract and immaterial of human senses, the view through the glass window. At the very same time, it's worth pointing out that the post-war automobile put a truly unprecedented amount of power into the hands of individual men and women. Again, Smil calculates that a horse can generate about 750 watts of power. Yet today, hundreds of millions of people drive vehicles whose power ranges from 100 to 300 kilowatts, up to 400 times the power of a strong horse. Thanks in part to such immense power, drivers could also achieve extraordinary speeds on the new American interstate highways or the German Autobahn, where they routinely traveled at 120 kilometers per hour and often a good deal faster here in Germany. While scholars have paid it little attention, the ability of a single human being to send thousands of kilograms of metal rocketing across the landscape surely shaped their thinking every bit as much as the cultural or political events of the day. Indeed, as the French scholar Rudolf Rapetti observes, such speed offered yet another path towards immaterialist transcendence. La vitesse est facteur d'immatérialité. Elle permet d'échapper à une forme de l'ordre et nous projette dans un monde abstrait. Today, there are roughly 1.5 billion private cars in use around the globe. And the number is rapidly increasing in many regions. For millions of people, the mass-produced automobile has, for good or bad, granted them a very real and very visceral sense of personal power and control. Yet even as the automobile provided individuals with such unparalleled power, it has continued to ever more thoroughly obscure its material sources. Modern cars have now become so technologically complex that few owners can even understand them, much less maintain and repair them. Moreover, many current manufacturers do not want owners to understand or work on their cars. Most new Mercedes, for example, no longer come with a physical dipstick for checking the engine oil, eliminating one of the last remaining ways in which an owner might be forced, if only for a few minutes, to gain at least some embodied physical sense of their dependence on that transformative natural resource. In this light, while the transition to fully electric vehicles may be a necessary step forwards to reducing global greenhouse emissions, it also seems evident that it's only going to further these illusions. The smooth, quiet power of the Tesla, free of the noxious sense of burning gas and hot oil, might well be the latest and greatest expression of our modern divorce from material reality. Indeed, some consumers apparently believe that the mere fact that a vehicle is electric in and of itself renders it environmentally friendly. How else to explain that, at least in the United States, even self-professed green consumers continue to purchase gigantic electrical vehicles with battery packs that are so heavy, they are just as energy hungry as a giant internal combustion SUV. Now, given all this, I ask you, what manner of extended minds might then emerge from such a monstrous pairing of immense power with little or no embodied sense of its actual material origins? Well, I suspect it might well be the very one that is now ascended in the United States, a nation whose democracy has increasingly curdled into a selfish libertarianism, an angry populism. When finally asked to confront the actual costs of the comfort and prosperity that they've long been used to, that's so long been unmoored from material realities, some Americans choose instead to retreat into denial and fantastic conspiracies. Of course, there are other causes for these phenomena than the automobile, of course. But maybe it's no coincidence that the first rumblings of the anti-government conservatism of Barry Goldwater and Ronald Reagan began nowhere else than in Southern California, home to that most pronounced American culture of the 20th century. Likewise, are we really to be surprised that it is Tesla's chief executive, Elon Musk, who has become the poster child for a modern techno-libertarianism, unmoored from responsibility or limits, constantly diverting our attention from the finite planet that we live on and towards the supposedly infinite resources his rockets will discover in the heavens above. The magical disappearing automobile, indeed. So yes, I have some bigger arguments to make here. Historians like myself are often too quick to claim that we've identified some new historical age of this or that. Catchy labels attract attention and they sell books. But given the sheer ubiquity of the phenomena I've discussed with you here today, I fear my proposed age of immaterialism may be all too justified. In this talk, I've only been able to give you a handful of representative examples, but I'd ask you to extrapolate from these, to imagine that the majority of your everyday environment is increasingly designed to facilitate these denials and obfuscations, that at every turn the material cues nudge our extended minds towards immaterialism. Some of these cues are relatively small, distributed, personal, like a concrete basement rec room, or the daily experience of driving a powerful automobile. Others are tectonic, like the shift from coal to oil, the occult nature of copper-based energy. Some, like chemicals and epigenetic effects, even penetrate inside our own bodies, where they shape who we are in ways that are as likely as profound as they are challenging to quantify. Regardless, they are everywhere. There were, of course, many other causes for these changes: economic, social, political, all of which demand more research, more discussion. International agreements and changes in regulations are obviously also essential. Yet these causes and solutions are mostly well recognized, whereas I believe we have significantly overlooked the role of our accelerating illusions of immateriality. If you still doubt its power, let me return to where I began and offer myself as exhibit number 1. While I don't wish to seem ungracious to my hosts, it would be hypocritical not to acknowledge that my flight from Montana to Dusseldorf contributed an astounding 2,500 kilograms of carbon dioxide and other global warming effects. That is 2,500 kilos for me alone. And that's just one way. This is nearly twice the global warming effects of all types that in an average citizen living in 56 other countries, from Burundi to Paraguay, would produce in an entire year. Appropriately or damningly, that 2,500 kilograms is not that much more than the weight of our family car. A 2015 Toyota Highlander, which clocks in at 4,600 American pounds. Ironically, like the many other environmentalist types who live in Bozeman, My family bought the Highlander in significant part because it allows us to get out and enjoy Montana's great outdoors. I was well aware of these materialities, and yet I chose to make the trip to Bochum anyways. I did so in part because I thought there was much I could learn from projects like Recourses and Transformation. I find it particularly pathbreaking that reform combines the resources of both universities and museums with their shared epistemological and theoretical focus on material artifacts of the past. This joining of archaeologists, museum professionals, I believe can play a powerful role in pushing it back against our current modernist illusions. That's why I was so enthusiastic by Lena Astray's, I apologize if I said that wrong, but explained in her research talk on Tuesday that the designers of the exhibit have managed to imagine creative new ways to recreate the embodied experience of coal miners, including even smells and noises. I'd argue this is precisely the materialist approach we need if we are to generate new extended minds that can better escape our modern illusions. Now, it would, of course, be unrealistic and counterproductive on a rapidly warming planet of 8 billion to return to the use of coal or gaslight, to dirt cellars and horses. We cannot go back. However, if we study the past, indeed engage with the past as the Reform Project and the Bergbau Museum are doing, we might learn to recognize the kinds of resources that are not only ecologically or economically sustainable, but that will also help to create, nurture, and sustain the kinds of human beings we must become. Still, if I had some good reasons to come to Bochum, I too have been infected by the age of immaterialism that perhaps made that decision a bit too painless, a bit too palatable. It's just simply become too easy to let the mysterious power of those massive Airbus A300 jet engines lift me to a higher plane of existence, far removed from the harsh realities of the world below. Again, not an excuse, but maybe something of an explanation for me and others like me. So you see now that I was not at all exaggerating in my earlier confession. I really am a peculiarly American monster. I leave it to you, having heard the confession of my sins, whether you wish to grant me some level of absolution. Thank you.